What's going on, everybody? My name is Daniel Smith, and I'm here to give you guys a user experience review of the game Vengeful Rites. This is an indie game that was posted on Reddit that I saw, and I thought it looked really cool to play, so I figured why not do a UX review at the same time. I want to preface this video by saying that I only played the demo, which gave me about an hour of gameplay. It may be less for other people, but that's how much it gave me, and I think it was enough for me to do a cursory analysis on this game. The way that I'm going to do this is I'll talk about a couple of different categories of UX, such as first use, navigation, and immersion, and things like that. And then at the end, I'll do a recap of the things I think this game did really well, the problems that I found, and some of the solutions that I have for those problems. So the first thing I want to talk about is first use. So first use is important in video games because that's kind of the make or break part. Whenever someone plays a game, if they get really frustrated in the beginning, they may not come back. They may think it's not fun and they just don't want to play it anymore. I think this game does a really good job in the first 10 minutes. They make things very obvious on what I have to do, which is important in gaming. The first 10 minutes, the way that the UX guideline is written is that it should be painfully obvious what the user has to do. So that way, if it's someone who's new, who's never played VR, who's never played an RPG, then they don't get lost in the very beginning. I am an experienced RPG player and VR player, so I didn't have this issue. And another thing that this game did really well is it allowed me to skip all of these tutorials. I didn't have to stand there and listen to the narrator. I could just do the thing I knew he was already telling me to do and then move on with my life. So the first 10 minutes of this game was really enjoyable, and I think they did a great job on this. The next part that I want to talk about is the inventory. So the inventory is a backpack that's actually on your back. You reach behind your shoulder, you grab it, pull it out, it opens and shows you cells with your items in it. Now, this is a really cool way to do it instead of mapping it to a button because it utilizes that physical property of VR that regular games don't have. Mapping things to buttons, in my opinion, is just bad UX for VR. Now, one of the problems that I did find with this inventory is that when you open it, the cells that pop up are pretty small, and so the items inside of it are even smaller. So someone who might be visually impaired even just a little bit might have a hard time seeing these. And so I would suggest, instead of opening it from the top, open the backpack from the front. So that way you have more surface area in the back. You can make the cells bigger while still fitting it inside of this backpack. I also want to talk about collecting items. So this is not tedious in this game, which is really nice because one of the things you have to consider in VR that you don't have to consider in other games is ergonomics. So if you have to bend down and pick something up a bunch of times, that's a really bad motion for your back or even maybe for your shoulders if you have to reach out. And you don't have to do that in this game because it's floating in midair, which I think is a really good way to do this. And you collect things by just going over it instead of having to manually go to each one, which I think is something this game did really well. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is something that's huge in VR, and that's navigation. So navigation in this game is pretty simple. You just either press down the trackpad to point to teleport, or you tap the trackpad to move in a certain direction with natural locomotion. The first thing I want to cover is that it does default to teleportation, which is the industry standard, so that is a good UX principle that was followed by this game, and that also is the standard to make sure people don't get sick. And so you don't want to default to natural locomotion because that is what makes people sick, and you want to make people choose that on their own. But they do give you this option in this game, which is good. Options are king when it comes to UX because you can fit it to a larger audience if you give people options. Now, you obviously can't have options for everything, but in this case, the locomotion, they did really well by giving the option for either one. One problem that I did face with the teleportation is that there's a black screen in between each teleport, which was really jarring because it goes from a bright contrast to dark to bright to dark, and it was just really jarring. So I would say get rid of that black screen if you can. Don't put the black screen at all, just put them in that new location immediately so that way that contrast doesn't change. It's actually not that jarring for VR players to do that instead of having something to break apart where you're standing versus where you're going. Now, natural motion is actually slower than teleportation in this game, which is a problem because I want to use natural locomotion because I don't get sick, but I couldn't in this game because it was slower and I'm impatient, so I wanted to get places faster. And when you're in combat, you can run away faster. Now, that being said, in combat, they did change the teleportation so that instead of it immediately taking the teleportation circle to wherever you're pointing, it would slowly move out there about the same speed as natural locomotion, but still a little bit faster. So I would say change the teleportation so that it does that all the time. It will move that circle out at the speed of natural locomotion, but at the same time increase the speed of natural locomotion because it was a little slow and sluggish, and there seems to be a lot of traveling time in this game, so I want to make sure I can get there without getting bored. One of the problems that I faced was I didn't really know where to go all the time. I did skip a part that was important and ended up having to come back and do it, but I didn't have a waypoint, or I'm sorry, I did have a waypoint, but I didn't have a quest. I didn't have a quest that I could reference anywhere. It's like, oh, you need to go do this. And I've noticed that you can't really do that anywhere, which is really important for RPGs. And there's also not a map in this game for me to say, okay, if my waypoint isn't immediately visible, where is it? So one thing that I suggest is in your backpack, you can put a scroll, or you can even put it on your strong arm's hip, because you don't put anything there. You have your sword on your weak hip, but on your strong one, have a scroll there. When you open it, it's got a little mini map, and it's got your location, any way markers that if you highlight it, it tells you what quest it is. And then on the right, have an empty space where you can put quests. You can put active quests, or you can have drop down lists, or whatever you want to do. Just display those quests somewhere, because that's really important for a game, especially in RPGs. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is immersion. Now, the immersion in this game was excellent. I really enjoyed and got lost in this game. The audios and visuals were perfect. The audio just fits with the environment. You know, you hear things you would hear in a forest. The fighting, the combat, and stuff like that works really well. There's a meteor that falls that has good audio. The visuals were what I expected. They're not hyper realistic, and that's not what I want, because we're doing magic. I want things to be magical. I want things to be virtual. Like I don't necessarily want crazy good graphics in this particular game, and I feel like the art style fit it really well. The use of gesture magic in this game was actually really immersive as well, because it utilized that physical attribute. Gesture control is something that is grossly neglected in VR, in my opinion. There are just not very many games out there that utilize it, and this one did a really good job. It wasn't overly tedious where I kept messing it up, and it wasn't making my arms tired, but it was making me do things over and over that made me feel like I was using magic instead of just pressing a button, which is stupid in VR, because we don't have to do that anymore. We can utilize our body, and I thought that helped with the immersion a lot. One of the problems of immersion that I found was that there's not a hand on your weapons in this game. So with a sword, it's not so bad because you can see the hilt, but like a bow, for example, it's not totally standard where your hand's going to go. So whenever I would try to figure out where my hand was, I would have to stop and think about it for a second. And I would say it'd be a good idea just to put a hand that wraps around wherever the controller is. So wherever that object's being tracked by the hand, put that hand in there, so that way I can just look at it. I don't actually have to like stand there and think about it for very long. Also, one thing I did forget to mention a little earlier is that the laws of physics are followed in this game, which is something that a lot of VR games don't do. When people pass through objects, it's very jarring. It's very immersion breaking whenever you can walk through something or stick your head in something, and in this one, it'll actually push you backward. It'll make you seem like you can't push your way through that object, which is really important and something that a lot of devs look over, and I'm very happy to see that it was done right in this game. Something I want to cover real quick is notifications. So notifications, trying to get information to the user, is really important, especially in a game like this that has a lot of mechanics. And I thought this game did a pretty good job of it. Whenever it pops with the text, there's someone talking to you. So if you want to do other things, then you can do other things, and you just listen to what they're saying, and he'll tell you what to do. Otherwise, if you want to read it quickly and move on with your life, they bold the text that's important, and you can just get what information you need, figure it out, and then move on. You don't actually have to listen to it, which is more into what I talked about earlier about being able to skip the tutorial, and the contrast on them was pretty good. Like trying to get the information across for the magic and the text and all that kind of stuff was pretty good, except for one little part that we'll talk about a little later in the general usability category. Alright, so the next thing I want to talk about is the combat. I'm going to try to talk about this really quickly. The combat in this game is awesome. I've already talked about the gesture magic, which was really cool to be able to use, but the parrying and the fact that you have a magic shield and all that is fantastic, and I really enjoy the combat. But the thing I want to point out the most is one of the problems that was overcome in this game, and that's the problem of too much physical activity. That's a problem with VR that we don't face with regular video games, and when we play fighting games, especially sword fighting games, people just swing their arm really quickly. And there's two problems that come up. They'll just wiggle their sword inside of an enemy and kill it too quickly, or their arms will get tired. So in this game, how far and fast you swing a sword matters. The faster and further, the more damage it does. But there's also a lag time after you hit an enemy where you can't do as much damage, which encourages you to try to be more tactical, try to block an attack or something like that, and wait a second before you use your next attack, which stops you from swinging like endlessly and trying to kill it really quickly. It forces you to be a little more immersed into the combat because you have to think about it a little bit more instead of just wildly swinging your arms, and that also overcomes the problem of waggling inside of the enemy because you have to swing a certain distance. So the combat in this game was awesome, and the difficulty of it was increased in a way that satisfies UX principles. So it increased the difficulty at a fairly slow rate so that I could learn the combat before I would get destroyed, and then once I finally got comfortable with the combat, I started being faced with multiple enemies and enemies of multiple types. So I think that the combat in this game, the developers nailed it this time. So the final thing I want to talk about is just general usability, just things in general that this game did right or wrong. So one of the problems that I mentioned a little earlier was that there was a small problem with contrast, which was with the protection magic. So in this game, you look at your opposite hand that you're using magic from, or either hand actually, and it'll have how much mana you have left to use that magic. And each magic has a different color, so that way you know what you're using. Well, with protection magic, it's a yellow glove with the yellow mana on top of it, which is kind of hard to see. So I would suggest changing that glove to white or light gray or something that contrasts better, or just make the protection magic a deeper yellow, something that contrasts a little more with that goldenrod-ish color that is the glove. The haptic feedback in this game was really good. I got haptic feedback from combat and picking things up, interacting with things, and even maybe bumping into things, shooting arrows, things like that. I think they did a really good job on that, and I think the haptic feedback is one of the most important things in VR, so I'm really glad to see that was hit in this game. This game is not overly punishing, which is really important, something that some people tend to look over. You don't lose anything as far as I can tell whenever you get killed. You just go back to your house. And one of the things that I want to mention is, even because I didn't finish the demo, I didn't go to the next area because that's where the demo ends. But when you die, you go back to your house. If that's the case in the next area, I think that is a usability problem, because that's going to be really annoying to have to run all the way back. However, if you don't do that and you just have a designated safe space for each area, then that's fine, and I think they did a good job of doing this. Then the last thing I want to talk about is the arrow icon. Whenever you destroy a barrel or something, the gold, silver, and the items that you can pick up will pop up. The icon for the arrow was kind of small, so it's not a huge deal, but I would say go ahead and make that bigger, so that way it's a little easier to spot since an arrow is small anyway. Okay, so just to recap, some of the things that I really liked about this game from a UX perspective is it does a good job of making tutorials painfully clear. It makes it very obvious in the first 10 minutes exactly what I'm supposed to do, and it also allows me to skip that tutorial if I'm an advanced user. When you collect items or pick anything up, it's not tedious, and you don't have to bend over and pick it up. It's usually floating in front of you, which takes into account the ergonomics of virtual reality gaming. The audio, visuals, the laws of physics being obeyed, and the use of gesture magic all make this a very immersive game. It makes me feel like I'm really in the environment, and it makes me lose track of time because I get stuck inside of this world whenever I'm playing it. The use of haptic feedback is very good. They use it in the devs use this in appropriate times, and it gives across information that I need. And this game is not overly punishing, so I don't get frustrated when I die, because I did die several times in the beginning because it took me a little while to get parrying right when I was in the middle of combat trying to keep myself alive. But even though I did die a few times, all I had to do was travel back, which is an understanding punishment. I didn't lose a bunch of things that affected me later in the game. So now that we've covered some of the stuff that I like, here are some of the problems and solutions that I came across in this game. So the interactive backpack is good, but the cells in it are pretty small. So I would say, instead of opening it from the top, open it from the front, and so that way you have a larger surface area behind it, and you can make those cells bigger and still keep it inside of the backpack. The black screen between teleportation, that's pretty jarring, because the contrast between that black screen and the world is very intense, and it really flashing at you is pretty rough. So I would say get rid of that black screen if you can, and just have it teleport them without actually changing the scene. It just changes straight to the new thing that they're seeing. Natural locomotion is slower than teleportation, which makes me use teleportation whether I want to or not. So just match those two and utilize that mechanic whenever you are in combat and the teleportation circle moves over time. You utilize that mechanic all the time and make them the same speed. And rather than decreasing the speed of teleportation, increase the speed of natural locomotion, because it does feel a little slow. There's no map in this game, so just give some kind of map. It might be on the back of the backpack. It might be in your backpack. It can just be an item, or you can even put it on your strong hand's hip, because I noticed that there was nothing down there. If something gets added to that later in the game, you can put it somewhere else, which, as I said, it can just be in the backpack, or it can be behind it, so that you turn around, you can see a little mini map. But if you don't add anything, then just put a scroll over there, and when they pick it up, they can look at their map and they can see. This is a place where you can also conquer the problem of not listing the quest anywhere, the quest goal, and not having the waypoints anywhere, that you can see it from anywhere, so that you know exactly where you're going. So just have a map on the right, have your current quest and any other quests that you can or want to look at, and then you can have waypoints and a reference to where the player is on that map inside that scroll. The hands are not shown on the weapons, which is kind of immersion breaking because I have to try to figure out where my hand is in the world. So just wrap a hand around it so that way we know exactly where that controller is, exactly where our hand is. The contrast for protection magic on your hand, checking the mana, is harder to see. So just change the color of the glove to a lighter color, white or light gray, or just change the mana to a more opaque yellow so that the contrast is higher. And then finally, the arrow icon, when you see it in the wild, is pretty small. So when you break a barrel and arrows are inside of it, just make that icon a little bit bigger. All right. All right, well, that's the end of my analysis. If you have any comments about how I may have done this, or if you want more information, or you may have seen some usability problem that I missed, or you have better suggestions, just let me know down in the comments. I'm always interested to hear people's opinions and their ideas. And if you want me to do a game, something that you think may need it or the dev may want to see it, just let me know. Or if you are a dev and you have a game that you want me to do an analysis on and give you recommendations, just let me know. This particular developer did not ask me to do this. I actually asked him because I thought that the game looked really cool and I was going to play it anyway, so why not do an analysis? But if you want me to do yours, I'd probably be happy to, so just let me know in the comments.